on the morning of the 8th of September, 2022, as the news came from Balmoral that Queen Elizabeth II had died. The woman who had just become Queen Consort stood a step behind Charles, and according to accounts attributed to household staff, her first feeling was not triumph, but dread. That night, aides say, Camilla asked a simple question of no one in particular, not to a friend, not even really out loud. Just a thought she let slip in a quiet room. Would anyone actually welcome her? Ask yourself honestly, if you had been in that crowd outside those gates, mourning the only monarch most people alive had ever known, would you have cheered for her? Because that was the room she was walking into, a grieving country, a family in shock, and a title she had waited longer to hold, openly, than almost anyone in modern royal history. Here is the thing that makes her dread so strange. She had just won. Overnight, with the stroke of a single death, she outranked nearly everyone who had ever doubted her, every courtier who had frozen when she entered, every relative who had smiled and quietly wished her gone. She was now Her Majesty the Queen Consort, and they answered to her. And she was afraid of the very rooms she now presided over. To understand why a woman would feel dread at the moment of her own elevation, you have to understand what the country still carried. Not what the palace said in its statements, what the country remembered, what it still whispered when her name came up at kitchen tables and in pub corners and in the comment sections of every newspaper that had ever run her photograph. For decades, Camilla Parker Bowles was not a person to most of Britain. Before we get to the coronation and what happened outside that abbey, one quick thing. If these untold palace stories, the ones the headlines skip over, are the kind of history you actually want more of, do me a favor and hit like and subscribe. That's genuinely how this channel keeps digging into stories like Camilla's, instead of the same recycled royal gossip. The bell just means the next one finds you. Now, back to that morning of the 6th of May, and the sound that never came. She was a name attached to a wound. She was the name Britain pinned to the collapse of a fairy tale. And what a fairy tale it had been. In 1981, a shy 19-year-old named Diana Spencer married the future king in front of 750 million people watching around the world. A glass coach, a wedding dress with a train longer than a bus, a prince and a princess, and a nation that let itself believe just for a day in something out of a storybook. When that story fell apart, the public went looking for someone to blame. And they found her. Camilla was cast as the other woman in the marriage of Charles and Diana, the one who had been there before Diana and, in the public's telling, never truly left. That framing hardened into something close to fact in the national imagination, and it was fed by moments that were impossible to spin away. The worst of them arrived in 1993, a private telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla, recorded and then leaked to the press, splashed across the papers in intimate, humiliating detail. The leaked 1993 phone call did something no palace spin doctor could undo. It made the affair real. It took a rumour and gave it a voice, and that voice belonged to the two of them, tender and careless, at Diana's expense. Overnight, the story stopped being gossip and became evidence. People had heard it now. They could quote it, and in millions of homes, the verdict was already in. Then came the year that fixed her in the nation's memory for good. In 1997, Diana died in a car crash in Paris, 36 years old, and the grief that swept across Britain was unlike anything the monarchy had seen in living memory. An ocean of flowers piled up outside Kensington Palace, so deep in places you could not see the ground. People queued through the night just to sign a book, and in that vast, raw collective mourning, a good part of the public reached for someone to hold responsible. Many of them reached for Camilla. It was not fair, and it was not entirely rational, but grief rarely is. When Diana died in 1997, Camilla became, for a large slice of the country, the figure who had helped break the princess they had loved. That was the sentence the public handed down, and it did not come with an appeal. So she went quiet. For years, she barely appeared in public. When she did, she was jeered. There are accounts of bread rolls thrown at her outside a supermarket in the late 90s, of crowds that curdled the moment she stepped out of a car. She was, by any measure, the most disliked woman in Britain who had never actually committed a crime. And yet the family did not cut her loose. Charles would not let her go. That, more than anything, was the private truth the palace spent years managing. He had been persuaded to give her up before, and he had never forgiven himself for it, and this time he simply refused. Which brings us to the wedding, and to a single decision that told you everything the palace never said out loud. In 2005, Charles and Camilla finally married, not in a grand cathedral, in a civil ceremony at Windsor, quiet by royal standards, followed by a religious blessing at St. George's Chapel. And here is the detail that historians and biographers keep returning to, because it speaks louder than any official line ever could. The late Queen, Elizabeth II, did not attend the wedding ceremony itself. She went only to the blessing afterwards. Stop and sit with that for a moment. The mother of the groom, the sovereign, the head of the Church of England, chose not to be in the room when her own son and heir was married. She came to the blessing, she smiled for the cameras, she gave a warm little speech at the reception with a joke about horse racing. But the ceremony, the actual moment of the marriage, she skipped. Remember that decision. It matters more than anything the palace said out loud. Because a queen does not accidentally miss her heir's wedding. Every movement of the monarch is planned to the minute, weighed, negotiated. Her absence from that ceremony was not an oversight. It was a message delivered in the only language the monarchy truly speaks, which is the language of who stands where and when, and beside whom. Biographers read it plainly. The decision told the family and anyone paying close attention exactly where Camilla stood. She was tolerated. She was accepted as a matter of duty. She was not, in the deepest sense, embraced. The sovereign herself had drawn a quiet line, and everyone at that court saw it, and no one needed it explained. And this is the pattern that would follow Camilla for the rest of her royal life. The protocol toward her was flawless, correct to the last degree and cold underneath. Perfect manners with the warmth switched off. The palace could do impeccable. What it could not seem to do for her was welcome. So she got to work. This is the part of her story the tabloids never found interesting, because there was no scandal in it, only patience. For 17 years after that wedding, Camilla did the least glamorous thing imaginable. She simply kept turning up. She took on charities that made no headlines. She smiled through crowds that had not decided about her. She let herself be photographed doing dull, worthy, unfashionable things. Day after day, year after year. She built goodwill an inch at a time, the way you fill a bath with a teaspoon, and slowly, very slowly, the temperature shifted. By the 2010s, the jeers had faded into something more like grudging acceptance. In 2022, in a message marking her 70 years on the throne, Elizabeth herself expressed a wish that Camilla be known as Queen Consort when the time came. That single sentence from the late Queen was, in its way, the closest thing to a public pardon that Camilla would ever receive. But a pardon on paper and a pardon in people's hearts are two different things. And Camilla, who had spent 17 years reading rooms for the smallest signs of what people really felt, knew the difference better than anyone, which is why, on that grey September morning at Balmoral, when the thing she had prepared for finally arrived, she did not feel the rush of a woman who had climbed to the top. She felt the chill of a woman who suspected the top was the loneliest place of all. Think about the strangeness of her position that day. Every person who had ever doubted her now had to bow. Every courtier who had struggled to be civil now had to serve. The relatives who had wished her gone now had to call her by a title above their own. She had the position. She had at last outranked them all. What she did not have was the pardon. Not the real one. Not the kind that lives in a warm room and a genuine smile and a crowd that means it when it cheers. She had the throne and not the affection. She had the rank and not the reprieve, and she knew it. That is what the dread was. It was not fear of the job. Camilla had done the job for years. It was the knowledge that she was about to be surrounded by people whose loyalty was owed and not felt, in a house that would treat her with total correctness and not one degree of warmth beyond it. There is a sound that greets someone who is truly loved. You have heard it. A room lifts when they walk in. A crowd roars from the gut. It is not something you can order or stage or command into being. It arrives on its own, or it does not arrive at all. Camilla had spent her whole royal life listening for that sound and not hearing it. And now, at the summit, she braced herself to not hear it on the grandest possible stage. The machinery of the monarchy does not pause for anyone's feelings. Within hours of the death at Balmoral, the great engine of succession began to turn. A new king had to be proclaimed, papers had to be signed, titles had to be spoken into existence formally, out loud, in front of witnesses, because in the British monarchy a thing is not fully real until it is said. And that meant a moment was coming, a small moment, and an enormous one. The accession would require the courtiers who had served Elizabeth II faithfully for decades, some of them for their entire working lives, to stand in Camilla's presence and speak 4 words, to say them clearly, to say them to her face, Her Majesty the Queen Consort, 4 ordinary words, on paper, nothing, a formality, a line of protocol, the sort of phrase that ought to roll off the tongue of any trained royal servant without a second thought. But words carry the weight of everything behind them. And behind these 4 words sat a 1993 phone call and a wall of flowers outside Kensington Palace, and a queen who had skipped her own son's wedding, and 17 years of a country that had never quite been able to say the word forgiven. Staff say that when the moment came, when the time arrived to give Camilla her new title aloud, one of them could not, Her Majesty the Queen Consort. 4 words, and staff say that when the moment came at the accession, an older footman who had served Elizabeth for decades hesitated visibly before he could get them out. Camilla noticed. Friends say she noticed everything. Think about what that hesitation actually was. Not rudeness. A footman does not do rudeness. He was too well trained to sneer, too disciplined to roll his eyes, too loyal to the machine to ever say a wrong word out loud. And yet, in the half a second before his mouth would form her title, something in him caught. A lifetime of service had taught his tongue to say, Her Majesty, about one woman only. And that woman was lying in state. The new one standing in front of him was, in his memory, the other woman, the name from the divorce. So he paused, and Camilla, who had spent 17 years learning to read a room faster than anyone in it, watched that pause and understood exactly what it meant. She said nothing. That was the discipline she had built. You do not correct a hesitation. You do not let your face show that you clocked it. You simply file it away, one more small piece of evidence about where you truly stand. And you move on to the next handshake, the next bow, the next flawless little transaction of the court, because the coldness inside those walls never came dressed as insult. That is the thing people misunderstand about a palace. Nobody was going to be cruel to her. Cruelty would have been a mistake, and this was an institution that did not make mistakes. What she got instead was correctness, perfect, gleaming, unbending correctness. The bows were the right depth, the forms of a dress were, after that first stumble, letter perfect. The seating plans honoured her rank to the millimetre. Every rule that said a Queen Consort must be treated a certain way, they followed, and not one single degree of warmth beyond it. That is the quiet weapon of a great house. It is also, in its way, the servant's revenge, because the staff are the ones who see everything and the ones who owe you nothing but the job. A butler can pour your wine with a face like a closed door. A dresser can lay out your clothes and never once meet your eye with real fondness. The protocol becomes a wall you can see through but never climb. Everything is done for you. Nothing is felt for you. And a person who has been welcomed, truly welcomed, can tell the difference in about 10 seconds. Camilla could tell the difference in 5. Then there were the rooms. Staff describe it, and it is a small detail that carries a whole world inside it. She would walk into a reception or a drawing room where household and courtiers had gathered, and the conversation would drop, not stop dead exactly, soften, trail off, rearrange itself into something more careful. Heads would turn, and then turn back a little too quickly, and the low warm hum of people who are comfortable with each other would thin out into polite murmur until she had passed through. Picture walking into a room and hearing every conversation stop. Now imagine doing it as queen. Imagine holding the highest female rank in the country and still feeling the temperature of a room drop a few degrees the moment you cross the threshold. Most of us have felt that once or twice in a lifetime, and it stings for a week. She felt it in her own home, day after day, from the very people paid to serve her. And here is the part that friends say cut deepest. She understood the quiet was about her. She did not tell herself a comforting story. She did not decide they were simply tired or busy or distracted by the morning. She knew. When a room goes still as you enter it, you can pretend it is a coincidence for a while. But Camilla had stopped pretending years ago. The silence had a subject, and the subject was her. So she made a decision about how to live inside that silence, and it tells you almost everything about the woman. She got smaller, not weaker, smaller. Aides recall that she began to arrive early to engagements before the crowd of staff and officials had properly assembled, so that she was already in place, rather than making an entrance that would trigger that awful hush. She would leave without fuss, no lingering, no working the room for affection she knew was not on offer. She took up as little space as a queen possibly can. She learned to move through her own palace like a guest who is grateful to have been asked, careful not to knock anything over, careful not to ask for too much. Think about how strange that is. The rank on paper said she outranked nearly every soul in that building. The behaviour said she was still auditioning, a Queen Consort tiptoeing through the corridors of her own house, timing her arrivals to avoid the sound of conversation dying. That is not the behaviour of someone drunk on power. That is the behaviour of someone who has learned, the hard way, that a title is a suit of clothes and welcome is something else entirely, something you cannot order a servant to bring you on a silver tray. And all of this, remember, was happening in private, behind the doors, in the rooms the cameras never saw. The public still had its own version of her, softening slowly over the years, and the palace kept that version carefully polished. But inside, the court had made its judgment in the only language a court is allowed to speak, the language of temperature, and the verdict was cold, which left one enormous question hanging over everything. If this was how it felt among the few hundred people whose literal job was to stand beside her, what on earth would happen when the whole world was watching? Because a date was coming, a date that could not be softened, could not be arranged early, could not be slipped out of quietly. The coronation, the 6th of May, 2023. This was the test that no amount of careful timing could manage. On that morning, the machinery of 1,000 years would roll out through London, and Camilla would be at the centre of it, in daylight, in front of the crowds and the cameras, and a global audience of hundreds of millions. There would be no back corridor to move through, no moment she could shrink out of. She would sit inside Westminster Abbey and be crowned, and the country that had spent decades deciding what it thought of her would at last get to make a sound. The question was, what sound? Outside on the morning itself, the pageantry did exactly what it was built to do. The Gold State coach, gilded and enormous, hauled through the wet London streets, flags along the route, rain that did not dampen the crowds pressed 10 deep behind the barriers, and there was cheering, real cheering, the kind that comes up out of a crowd like heat. They cheered the king. They cheered the spectacle, the horses, the soldiers, the sheer improbable survival of the thing. And when William and Catherine passed, the young family, the future, the faces the public had decided to love, the noise swelled into something genuinely warm. That is the sound of a nation greeting people it has taken into its heart. Now listen for what is missing in the next moment, not the boos, the silence where the cheering should be. Because witnesses in the crowd, the people standing on the mall who had come to feel every gust of the day's emotion, reported something different when it came to Camilla. Not hostility. That is the crucial thing, and it is easy to get wrong. Nobody jeered. There was no ugly scene, no protest that made the news, no boos ringing off the buildings. What there was, instead, was a flatness, a politeness without heat, the clapping that comes from good manners rather than from the chest, a crowd doing the correct thing, applauding the Queen Consort as one is supposed to applaud the Queen Consort, and giving her not one degree of warmth beyond it. Do you hear the echo? It was the exact same weapon the court had used in the silent rooms of the palace, only now the wielder was the whole country, and the stage was the biggest one on earth. Correctness without love, the rules honoured, the feeling withheld. She had walked out of a house that would not warm to her, and into a nation that would clap for her, and not for her. And the roar simply did not come. The great swelling wall of sound that had lifted for Charles, for the crown itself, for the young couple, thinned to that same careful applause the moment she was the subject. The sound that greets someone truly loved was, in her direction, absent. Staff would later describe it as the loudest thing about the whole day. That absence, if a silence can be loud. The one sound she had asked for, in her own quiet way, from that first night at Balmoral. The one thing all the protocol in the world could not manufacture. Inside the Abbey, the ceremony went ahead in flawless order, of course. It always does. She was led to her place. She was anointed, and she was crowned with Queen Mary's crown, a real crown lifted from its history and settled onto her head in front of the world, a moment most people alive will never witness even once. By every measure the state recognized, it was complete. She was queen, anointed, titled, crowned. The machinery had done everything it was designed to do, and it had done it beautifully. And yet, she had the throne and not the affection. She had the position and not the pardon. Sit with that gap for a second, because it is the whole story compressed into a single afternoon. Everything a monarchy can give a person, she now had. Everything a monarchy cannot give a person: a nation's forgiveness, a room that lights up when you enter it, the roar that means we are glad you are here. She still did not have. The crown was on her head, and the welcome was nowhere in the building. You could see it if you knew where to look, not in her face, because she had trained that face for 17 years and it gave nothing away, but in the arithmetic of the day. The cheers had an address, and it was not hers. The warmth had recipients, and she was not on the list. She had climbed further than the other woman from the divorce could ever have dreamed of climbing, all the way to the crown of a 1,000-year-old kingdom, and she had arrived to find the house cold and the street polite and the roar reserved for other people. So she had the crown and not the welcome. And here the story turns, because what Camilla did next was the opposite of what a woman starved of affection is expected to do. The expected thing, the human thing, would have been to chase it, to smile wider, to court the cameras, to lean on the palace machine to soften her image, to demand in 100 small ways the warmth the country was withholding. That is what almost anyone would have done. That is what pride and hurt would have pushed her toward. She did not chase the warmth. She did not demand the pardon. She looked at the silent rooms and the polite crowds and the roar that never came, and she made a choice that no image consultant would have advised. She reached instead for the least glamorous work in the kingdom, and it changed everything. The least glamorous work in the kingdom, not the galas, not the state banquets where the cameras waited. Camilla reached instead for domestic abuse survivors, for literacy, for the unfashionable causes no one fought to be photographed beside. And she let those causes, not her charm, do the arguing. Understand what a different woman would have done. A different woman handed a crown and no cheer to go with it, would have gone looking for the cheer. She would have chased the popular cause, the one with the celebrities and the red carpet, the one that photographs well and makes a headline soft. She would have leaned into charm, worked the rooms, tried to be liked. That is the obvious move. It is also the move that almost never works, because a country that has decided you are cold can smell effort from a mile away, and effort only confirms what it already believes. Camilla did the opposite. She did not fight the coldness. She did not demand the warmth. She simply kept turning up. That is the whole strategy, and it is almost insultingly simple. She turned up to the refuge no camera crew wanted to visit, to the reading group in the ordinary community hall, to the survivors' charity, operating on a budget you could count on 2 hands. According to accounts attributed to household staff and to the people who ran these organizations, she did not arrive with a wall of press behind her. She arrived early, often, and quietly, and she stayed longer than the schedule allowed. Start with the domestic abuse survivors, because that is where the pattern is clearest. For years, Camilla had been building relationships with refuges and helplines, the kind of places most public figures visit once, smile for the photograph, and never think about again. She went back. She learned names. She sat with women who had walked out of their own homes with nothing, women whose stories the country never heard, and she listened without a lens pointed at her face. Staff at these places described something that surprised them. She knew the details. She remembered the woman from the last visit, the one whose case had gone to court, and she asked how it ended. Then, the literacy work, reading, books, children who had been written off before they were 10. A cause with no glamour attached to it at all. There is no scandal in a child learning to read, no drama, no front page. which is exactly the point. Camilla put her name and her time behind the unphotogenic middle of the problem, the boring, grinding, essential work of getting words into the hands of people who had been shut out of them. She started reading groups. She championed authors nobody had heard of. She did the thing that does not trend. Now think for a second about how this reads to the people watching most closely. Not the public, the court, the household, the courtiers who, only months earlier, could barely bring themselves to say, Her Majesty the Queen Consort out loud. The footman who fell silent when she walked into a room. These were the people who had measured her and found her wanting, and these were the people who now watched her, week after week, do the work that no one made her do. Because here is a truth about palaces that the public rarely sees. The institution does not run on affection. It runs on service. It keeps a private ledger, and in that ledger charm counts for almost nothing, and consistency counts for almost everything. The courtiers who had served Elizabeth II for 40 years did not warm to Camilla because she was charming. They had seen charming come and go. What they had not often seen was someone with a crown and no obligation to earn it, still choosing to earn it anyway. Think about the last person who won you over, really won you over, the one you were sure about after you had been unsure. Was it charm? Or was it just showing up every single time until the showing up became the argument? For most of us, it is the second one. Charm impresses for an evening. Reliability changes your mind for good. That is the trade Camilla made, whether she planned it or not. She stopped trying to be forgiven and started letting herself be measured. She let the institution do the measuring on its own terms, by its own cold ledger. Not by the leaked phone call, not by the 17 years of jeers, by the diary, by how many engagements, how many refuges, how many quiet mornings when there was nothing in it for her but the work itself. And slowly, biographers argue, something shifted, not a roar, nothing that loud, but the silence began to change its texture. The rooms that had gone quiet when she entered began, here and there, to stay ordinary. The courtiers who had hesitated over her title said it over time without the hesitation. Respect started to fill the space where welcome had never come, and respect, once it settles into a place like that, is a very different substance from the thing she never got. It is heavier. It does not evaporate when the crowd goes home. Here is why that matters, and this is the heart of it. Affection demanded loudly is the weakest thing in the world. You can beg a nation to love you and get nothing but resentment for the asking. But respect earned quietly, one unglamorous morning at a time, is almost impossible to take back because it was never given to you as a gift. You built it. It has your fingerprints on it, and a thing you built yourself cannot be withdrawn by a change in the public mood. That is the difference between the individual and the institution, and Camilla, of all people, understood it. The individual wants to be loved. The institution wants to be served. Diana, for all her genius, gave the country love and asked for love back, and when the love turned, it nearly destroyed her. Camilla never had the option of love, so she gave the country service instead, and she asked for nothing. And in the asking for nothing, she found the one currency the palace could not refuse to pay her. She was measured, and she passed. But let us be honest, because this channel does not deal in tidy endings. Respect is not the same as welcome. It is not the same as the thing she stood in Balmoral and quietly wondered about on the worst night of her professional life. Respect is the court saying, "You have earned your place." Welcome is something warmer, something you cannot schedule into a diary or build one refuge visit at a time. And the hard question, the one that has hung over this entire story, is whether that warmer thing ever actually came. So go back with me to where we began, to the morning of the 8th of September, 2022, to the woman standing a step behind Charles at Balmoral as the news came down from that room, the woman who had just become Queen Consort of the United Kingdom, and whose first feeling, according to aides, was not triumph, it was dread. And to the question she is said to have asked, of no one in particular, into the quiet of that terrible night, would anyone actually welcome her? So answer the question we started with, now that you have seen it all, now that you have watched her walk into silent rooms and understand exactly why they were silent, now that you have watched courtiers struggle with 4 words of her title, now that you have watched her, at the coronation on the 6th of May, 2023, crowned with Queen Mary's crown, anointed, titled, given every formal thing the crown can give a person, standing in a crowd that cheered Charles and cheered William and Catherine and did not, for her, quite roar. That missing sound. Remember it, the absence of the noise that greets someone truly loved. It was there at the accession, and it was there at the coronation, and if we are honest, it is probably still there, because you can crown a woman queen in front of the entire watching world. You can put the historic crown on her head, and have the Archbishop anoint her, and have the cameras carry it to 1 billion people, and she can walk back down that aisle with the position secured and the pardon still withheld. She can have the throne and not the affection. She can have the title her whole life bent toward and still, inside her own house, be waiting for someone to finally say, "Welcome home." That is the honest verdict, not a fairy tale, not a redemption with a bow on it. The welcome, the real one, the warm one, the raw, most likely never fully came. What came instead was quieter and in its way, more remarkable, a grudging, hard-won institutional respect. The court stopped hesitating over her name. The staff stopped falling silent. The ledger balanced. And a woman who was once the most disliked figure in the country became, without ever winning the nation's heart, someone it could no longer dismiss. Is that enough? That is the ache the story leaves you with, and I am not going to pretend it away. For most of us, respect without warmth would be a lonely prize, to be corrected at, protocoled at, served with flawless manners and not 1 degree of heat beyond them, to win the room and still not be embraced in it. There is a coldness in that no title fixes. But consider what she was working with. Consider that the alternative was to keep chasing a love that 17 years of effort had not delivered, to keep reaching for a warmth the country had decided, back in 1997, it would not give her. She could have spent the rest of her reign begging. Instead, she stopped begging and started building, and she built something real out of the coldest material a public life can hand you. That is not nothing. In some ways, it is the harder thing, and the more durable one. This is what her first days as Queen Consort reveal, and it is the whole reason her story is worth telling. The gap, the distance between the image the crown projects and the private reality behind the palace doors. The public saw a coronation, gold and horses and 1 billion viewers, the picture of a monarchy at ease with itself. Behind the doors, there was a woman arriving early and leaving without fuss, taking up as little space as a queen possibly can, reading the temperature of every room she entered, and knowing the chill was meant for her. The image was warmth. The reality was a ledger, slowly, grudgingly, tipping her way. And that gap is the real subject here, not just for Camilla, but for all of them. The crown sells you the pageant, what it costs the person wearing it, the loneliness of the correct but cold room, the price paid in private for the picture shown in public. That part is never on the postcard. Camilla's early reign is one of the clearest windows we have into that cost, precisely because she never got the softening that hides it. Elizabeth had the nation's love to cushion the loneliness of the role. Camilla had the loneliness without the cushion, and she carried it anyway, quietly, for as long as it took the doubters to run out of reasons. So picture her one more time. Not at the coronation, in the crown, under the lights. Picture her at some ordinary refuge on some grey ordinary morning, no press, no roar, sitting with a woman the country will never hear about, listening. That is where she won the argument. Not in the Abbey, in the rooms nobody photographed. She won the room she was given by the simple, relentless refusal to leave it, by turning up when there was nothing in it for her, by letting the work speak in a language the palace could not argue with. And yet, for all of that, for the respect banked and the doubters quieted and the ledger balanced, the last image is still a woman waiting, crowned before the world, correct in every protocol, served with flawless manners in silent rooms that learned, eventually, to stay ordinary when she walked in, a queen by every measure the crown can offer, still listening on some level for a sound that never quite arrived, still waiting inside her own house after all of it to hear someone say welcome home. Maybe respect was always going to be the most she could win. Maybe, for a woman who came to the throne carrying what she carried, respect was the truer prize anyway, the one that lasts after the applause a warmer figure would have chased has long gone quiet. That is for you to decide. The story only insists on this much. She was crowned queen in front of the entire world. And the one thing the whole world could not give her, she had to build alone, one unglamorous morning at a time, out of the very coldness that was meant to defeat her. Would anyone actually welcome her? That was the question at Balmoral. The answer in the end was that she stopped waiting for the welcome and earned the respect instead. And she stood in the space where the welcome should have been, correct, composed, unbroken, and simply refused to leave it, until the refusing itself became her answer.